Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gary Pine. I'm the Chief Product and Marketing Officer for W2. Although you can't see me on the screen today, this is the third session in a series of webinars related to the kind of gaming, the gambling, and the betting markets. And once again, we've assembled an esteemed set of industry experts who no doubt are pressing buttons and moving things around on the screen. So I'll hand you over now to our moderator for today, Mr. Peter Murray.
Great, thanks for that, Gary. Good afternoon, everyone, and as Guy said, welcome to the third of a series of webinars aimed primarily at just creating debate whilst we're all sort of stuck at home. All still doing our jobs, but a bit more time to maybe look at the conversations that are going on. We try to vary the content. Our first one was looking at the initial effects of COVID-19. Last week's was looking at safer gambling, the range of stakeholders from sort of Australia to the US. But we come much more back to home now, and we think we've got a pretty special edition for everybody to listen into. But first, I'd like to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, a quick sort of 30 seconds on who they are, their role, their background in the sector. And I think I'll come to you first, Gary. You can tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Sure. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jerry. I'm actually the Managing Director for the S-King IOM. So we are actually registered in IOM, and we received the license from the IOM, and we are preparing the official launch of our online poker product in Q3 this year. Before S-King IOM, I used to work on the corporate dev and strategy department for PokerStars. Right now, they just actually merged with the Flutter. Thank you.
Yeah, I think anybody who hasn't heard about the Flutter Entertainment is relatively new to the sector. Paul, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself, please?
Hi there. Yeah, so I'm Paul Williams. I'm the Group Director of Compliance at PariPlay. We work a lot with operators, vendors across many jurisdictions worldwide.
Okay, good stuff. Thanks for that. Neil, if you a little bit about yourself, that'd be great.
Hi everyone, I'm Neil Young. I'm the owner of a small consultancy firm, Hillcrest Pragmatic. I've been working in the gaming industry for about 10 years, formerly worked for Paddy Power PLC, working in operations. And these days I mainly work in AML compliance, regulatory compliance, customer service, and operational efficiency.
Stuff. Quite frankly, I feel a bit silly asking the next participant who he is and what he does. But Andy, over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Andrew Lyman. I'm the Gibraltar gambling regulator. I've been in the industry for about 15 years. I'm a regulatory lawyer by trade, but I started in the gambling industry as the Director of Monitoring and Compliance at the UK Gambling Commission. I then went to the Association of British Bookmakers, and then for nearly a decade I worked for William Hill in compliance and regulatory affairs. And now I'm back in the public sector again. So I've gone public sector, private sector, and back to the public sector again as a regulator.
The circle of gaming life, I think that's correct. All right, thanks guys. I think for those who don't know me, my name's Peter Murray. I head the group sales at W2, 12 years in the sector, mainly data, technology, around the identity space, and we provide sort of compliance, KYC, RegTech, single gateways to access those solutions around that. But quite frankly, enough about me. It's not while you're here. It's not often we get a chance to discuss major changes in regulator strategy, especially with one of the key jurisdictions housing some of the major global brands. But like all aspects of the sector regulation, it's changing and adapting to a whole range of challenges. So I guess if you're an operator, it feels like there's an entire tsunami of constant complexity that's raining down on you. It's AML, it's RegTech, it's merging data sources, customer preferences, trust, sustainability. I think the central tenet at the moment is around sort of harm minimization. So I think it's fair to say that the world's a very different place from even 2 years ago. And then COVID-19 hits us. So in that sort of ever fluid situation, how do those tasked with regulating the industry keep up? So regulators can be blind, whilst undoubtedly they do have a difficult job to do, they'll always do the best they can. And certainly it seems to go about it, each of them seem to go about it in their own way. But today we have the pleasure of discussing all of those challenges. And as Gibraltar is not immune from any of them, I'm going to throw in a bit of Brexit for us all to talk about, because Constantine objected seems a long time ago over the last couple of weeks. It's all about Andy giving us his view from the Gibraltar government side. We have a panel from across the spectrum, really. Jerry's going to be bringing us the operator perspective, the expertise around stars and the Asian dealings. Paul, that multi-jurisdictional compliance view from his time at Parry Play and beyond. With Neil's job is to keep dragging us back to reality as we discuss the practical measures needed to make all of the stuff we're talking about to come together. So finally, before I get into the discussion, we really want you to join the debate. We don't get the chance often to speak to a regulator who's happy to talk about the strategy and the relevant areas we're discussing live. So please feel free to join us. There's a chat function on there. Fire questions across, and I'll try and involve them as we're going along. If I don't get to them, hopefully I'll get to them at the end. So, as absolutely nobody on here has come to listen to me, then I thought I'll go over to Andy. Andy, do you want to, let's start with the COVID-19 thing. We'll come to the changing regulations, but what's the current situation for you and generally Gibraltar?
Well, Gibraltar remains in lockdown, although that was eased slightly on Saturday because now non-essential shops are open. But it's clearly still a lockdown situation where there are limitations on people's travel and freedoms. I mean, the Gibraltar government is about to issue a plan for exit, which obviously, like any other government, will be a stage plan. But I think more importantly, the government's also already announced a Project Future plan, which is actually headed by 3 government ministers, which is all about getting the Gibraltarian economy moving again after the lockdown and looking to the future, because obviously COVID-19 will change things and have an impact on things like tourism here, for example. And the gambling sector is actually seen as a very, very significant part of restarting the economy. And obviously one of the main aims is to maintain Gibraltar as a major gambling hub. I mean, what I don't want to do is sort of engage in a sort of monologue, but what I thought I might do, with your permission, is just give you an overview of where we are, sort of set the scene, and then obviously allow people to ask as many questions as possible. And I will be as candid as possible, and I'll also be candid where there's a question above my pay grade, which would be generally a political question, which I felt that I wasn't able to answer.
No, I absolutely appreciate that. Fire away.
But I mean, as I've said, you know, Gibraltar values the industry. It wants to maintain the industry. This has been a major gambling hub for a long time. I think if you monitor the media and the industry press, I mean, there are always stories about the potential demise of Gibraltar. There were stories around when the point of consumption tax was introduced in the UK, and obviously, you know, Brexit has caused quite a lot of material, I suppose, for speculation. But in the main, the industry is sustained here. The numbers of people haven't gone down significantly, and I think that probably can be attributed more to a sort of stable, effective and supportive government. I don't think you can actually underestimate that, certainly for senior gambling executives, being in a jurisdiction where you are actually welcome and considered to be part of the mainstream business community. I mean, that will occur in other jurisdictions as well, but I don't think you can underestimate that. And as far as the sort of COVID-19 planning has been done, I mean, plainly, in many respects, the government of Gibraltar had already had a workout because of its Brexit contingency planning. And I think that stood it in really good stead in terms of slipping into this particular crisis. I mean, obviously, there are views about what the government does or doesn't do, but generally, I think the overall overarching view is the government has handled the crisis very competently. And obviously, there's a lot of cause for optimism. I mean, the border flow was obviously significantly reduced because of the Spanish decree, but the border hasn't closed, and we can come back to frontier risk at a later stage. Yeah. And you know, broadly, there appears to have been, in perhaps one of the most difficult times, a sort of shared appreciation of the relationship between the Campo in Spain and Gibraltar, you know, really in terms of the contribution that Gibraltar makes to the Campo. and also the contribution that Spanish workers make to the health service here, retail industry, and obviously the wider service industry, which hopefully will start to reopen fairly soon. And the government's formed an economic liaison committee to allow the industry to have a sort of direct, say in what goes on, and we've got a contingency framework, so we're talking to operators all the time, so we fully understand, the stresses that are on them. And there's a whole spectrum here. There are the sports betting operators who are really struggling in terms of loss of revenue. There are operators with more of a skew to gaming who are doing relatively well. And Paul may want to comment on this later on, but obviously some of the B2B game suppliers are actually seeing increased levels of business, and we're trying to support some of that business as well by looking at approvals, for example, for virtual betting content, because obviously it won't close the gap for sports betting operators, but again, it provides a bit of a boost for them. I mean, that's a sort of COVID overview. I've got a sort of overview more widely of what we're doing to prepare Gibraltar for the future, but I'll break off now to see if there's any questions.
No, I think it's fascinating that I guess the planning and preparation around Brexit has sort of given you a heads up on trying to deal with this. I think we all look at it negatively. I think a lot of people do, but obviously the questions around where Gibraltar is going were brought up by that, and there's sort of that wider communities going where the place fits between say Malta, the Isle of Man, the sort of .co.uk type response. So I think it's fascinating that it's given you that background. I think probably the thing to do, unless there's any questions on I mean, Paul, just from your perspective, you're in Gib. What's life like there at the moment, just quickly?
No, it's fine. It's been kind of a long lockdown. I think the Gibraltar itself did very well to contain it very early. Thankfully we've not had any deaths, and but from a gaming sense, we've certainly been working a lot with the Gibraltar Gambling Commission, with Andrew and his team, trying to push through quite approvals mainly for virtuals, because obviously a lot of the operators wanted to take virtual sports. I think we've definitely seen in April a big increase in our figures from our aggregation platform Fusion, but I think some of that's attributed to COVID, some of that's attributed to kind of the work we did about 6 months ago. So in kind of the aggregation world, you generally tend to see the fruits of your loins in about six months after you've implemented a strategy. So it's interesting, and it'd be interesting from our point to see in 6 months' time, what the figures look like then, and whether they decrease or increase.
And I think that sort of sat in the middle of it. It's difficult to tell. I think we'll all look back interestingly in 6 to 12 months and see how the world's changed. I think realistically, and I think the audience here, we obviously know Gibraltar's in a very competitive situation. But I think the key thing is, I think there's a poll up there for anybody who wants to have a look at a starting point for start. But if you want to tell us really how things are changing, Andy, what's happened with the consultations, where Gibraltar's heading, I think that will spark the debate around what those actions are going to be, what needs to happen. So if you want to give us an overview of that, that'd be terrific.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this goes back well before pre-COVID time, when companies were looking at their contingency arrangements in a post-Brexit environment, and I think everybody has planned on a continuity basis for a worst-case scenario, which was a hard Brexit scenario. And obviously, we'd engaged with operators quite considerably along the road in terms of their contingency planning. I mean, I think people will know here that historically Gibraltar has broadly insisted, although there are some notable exceptions, which we're entitled to make under the legislation, that the IT infrastructure had to be housed in Gibraltar. Well, we've already had to be a lot more flexible with that, because obviously we didn't want operators, particularly our large B2Cs, to have to make binary decisions about being in one jurisdiction or another. And the impression that I get is operators want to be here, but they obviously were concerned about not only Brexit, but obviously all the developing issues around the availability of hypercloud as well. And so we've had to be a bit more flexible in terms of what we do and don't allow as far as IT infrastructure is concerned. And that's really led into a number of streams of work. One is we're currently in the process of rewriting the legislation, because the Gambling Act was 2005. And although in many respects, to use a phrase, it was fit for purpose, in other ways it needs to be modernised, and we need to look at what we articulate in terms of IT infrastructure. We also need to look at what actually triggers licensing, and one of the key issues that we're looking at the moment is adding, as financial services is here, one of the triggers will be mind and management as opposed to just the IT infrastructure. And certainly I've had a very clear ministerial steer around the whole issue, certainly for B2Cs. B2Bs is slightly more complex, and we can come on to that. But as far as B2Cs are concerned, that we're not a brass plate jurisdiction. So one of the things that we're looking at is ensuring that the operators who are licensed here from a B2C perspective also have substance here. But the issue is, I think we can be flexible on what substance means. So substance could mean mind and management, substance could mean IT infrastructure, and if you've got a lot of people here, you've got a lot of offices here, and you're contributing a lot to the Gibraltar economy, then plainly we can be more flexible, for example, with the IT kit, because you've got substance here. So it's I'm not saying that this is easy, and there are some thorny issues which we are currently teasing out as part of the consultation while we manage this change. But there are lots of advantages to being in Gibraltar, tax advantages. Be quite candid. The fact that the advertising doesn't carry VAT here is a big anchor for the industry here. And obviously corporate tax rates are relatively favourable compared to other jurisdictions. So, operators plainly want as much discretion as possible, but there's got to be a conversation about give and take. So you can't take all the benefits and give nothing back to the jurisdiction. But broadly, we're moving away from data localization per se to a more liberal view of what we allow in terms of cloud infrastructure. And plainly, not only are we having to have that conversation with our existing licensees, but we're also having to have that conversation with, and I wouldn't say there's a long queue, but there is a queue of prospective B2B and B2C licenses. Even now we're processing applications, so people are still interested in coming to the jurisdiction. But there's a number of strands to this. One is we've got to hold on to what we've got, because you're right, we do have a lot of blue chip companies here, but we've also got to move in the direction of attracting new business here, whether that is startups, whether it's businesses that might want to relocate to Gibraltar, and also, and you made the point about Malta, we will lose some European business from here, if not all European business, because that business will have to be conducted, for example, under a Maltese license. But we're already moving away from being a point of supply jurisdiction, and that still hasn't caused the exit. So again, it is very much multifaceted, and I think we're going to have to replace some of that European business with, business in emerging territories, with Asian business, and see what else we can attract here without surrendering the good name that the jurisdiction has for proportionate and reasonable regulation.
And I think it's a great point, because I think it's got to be, I'll come to the other guys in a second, I guess it's got to be around flexibility, because you are known for the blue chips being there. Yes, but if we generally, and it's fascinating around the debate around Malta, because obviously the conversations around Malta are going to take people, but there's reasons to be in every jurisdiction. So if we come to Paul first on this, because you deal across on a compliance level across multi-jurisdictions. What's your thought process around the differences on the regulators, but specifically around maybe advantages and challenges have been in GIB?
Yeah, I think if you compare it to other jurisdictions, I think when Andrew talks there around, emerging markets, Asia, it's very, the minute the go-to jurisdiction for that is the Isle of Man, primarily for the non-EU markets, particularly Asia. Most operators licensed there are Asian facing. But I think with Gibraltar, you get, the stability, the regulator is very welcoming, and it's very easy to go and speak to Andrew and his team. And generally, I think that, like Andrew said, the VAT advantage is good. There are some other kind of disadvantages with Gibraltar compared to other jurisdictions, but I think that the VAT advantage on the marketing far outweighs outweighs those as well. I think Andrew's obviously looking at implementing new regulation, trying to diversify basically what they have at the minute. So it's at the minute all the right noises are being made. Most of the operators that approach me to talk about licensing, for the non-EU markets, are weighing up the 3 jurisdictions really is Curacao, Isle of Man, and Gibraltar. I think the companies with kind of less capital to put into they will generally go to Curacao to begin with to go and get proof of concept. And then once they have that and they want to go into a tier 1 jurisdiction, it's a toss-up of between Gibraltar and the Isle of Man, with most of them going Gib from my perspective anyway.
I guess, Neil, you're sat sort of there in the Isle of Man, who are one of those key ones looking to attract business, clearly a recognised base for Asian-facing operators. What's your view generally around what attracts people to different regulations?
Yeah, so I think stability is it can't be underestimated at all. Anytime there's a change, even if we have consultation, even if we have like a 2-year lead period into that where people have been able to put their input in, each change is dramatic for companies. It affects the bottom line. And the same as with a lot of practical things that we do in business. We make a plan and we say we're going to execute it, and this regulation should have that kind of impact on our revenue. But there's nothing like actually seeing what it works out as in practice. I think when you said earlier, Andrew, people were worried about putting a consumption tax, and there's been lots of scares and things like that. We see the same with regulation. So I think the things that we've been learning over here, and certainly that I see from a more practical perspective when we're trying to do our KYC, and we're dealing with, let's face it, like Asian business can be challenging because whereas like for UK business or in Europe, we have a certain type of ID card, we've got even just the characters that are used. When we start getting into Cyrillic and different types of characters, and Peter, you'll know this from experience, it starts becoming quite difficult to get your electronic verifications done. So I think it's quite interesting. The part about stability is very interesting to me. The Isle of Man just recently had its new regulations come out, last year, and we're starting to manage the impact of those. I think everything that Andrew's saying sounds very interesting, to be honest. It's quite aligned with what a lot of businesses are looking at right now.
Yeah, I think, Jerry, if we come to you both from running an operator's business, but also an Asian-facing perspective, which is clearly a number of regulators are going to be interested in that. What's your views on what operators, what would you want to see? What's the key things to an operator like yourself?
Sure. I think from an operator perspective, I would say we are looking for a balance of a few different things. Number one, as I think the most important thing is definitely the regulation framework. It's also an interesting balance between the regulators and operators. I mean, for example, we are looking for the reputation of the regulation. When we actually get to apply for the license and also actually package the product to our customers, we want our customer to know that our product is regulated by a very by a jurisdiction with a very, very good reputation. I think that's very important. Even in a lot of the Asian markets, also Latin America countries, this is definitely very important for the end customer. The other two areas, I would say, one is actually the talents, because we need the support from the local talents in order to help us operate the company. That including, for example, corporate service provider, legal firms, as well as other supporting functions. The last one, I would say, of course, which is equally important, is the tax environment, because that including corporate tax, VAT, as Andy just mentioned. Those are, I would say, yeah, regulation framework, the talent support, as well as the tax environment. We are looking for a balance of these three things mainly.
I think, Andy, I think the talent one's always going to be an issue for, what's termed smaller jurisdictions. What's the view from Jib on how you get the right people and can staff up those businesses?
Well, I mean, certainly I mean, my perspective is that GIB is still a sort of hub of intellectual property as far as gambling is concerned. I mean, plainly, Brexit caused some lack of confidence in the jurisdiction, but we have seen, people willing to come here and work here, and obviously quite a flow of talent between different operators, which actually to some extent may have pushed market prices up a little bit in those terms. So there's definitely proven talent and knowledge and intellectual property within Gibraltar as far as the gambling industry is concerned. As far as the support industry is concerned, corporate services, I mean, GIB is an international finance centre, and there are certainly no shortage of lawyers with gambling expertise in Gibraltar, and obviously also people who are used to establishing the right sort of level of corporate structures as well for the type of business. So I never do what I would call a hard sell of Gibraltar. And I never, as a matter of course, run any other jurisdiction down. In fact, ultimately, I think it is for the operator to make a decision about which jurisdiction it wants to be in. And in fact, one of the things I'm quite keen on, and we'll continue to push for, is I think certainly there's a degree of regulatory cooperation between regulators. But I think obviously because operators now are multi-jurisdictional, through necessity, that actually some degree of MOU between various operators is also quite an advantageous thing, because obviously, if we have an operator, for example, who has a license in Malta and a license in Gibraltar, and then there are issues around data and dates and all sorts of things, having an MOU between the regulators is probably something that assists, and also potentially leads to some degree of regulatory consistency between regulators as well.
Do you generally, I mean, I guess that topic of regulatory harmonization discussion has been talked about for so long, collaboration's the word. Are we genuinely seeing things moving in the right direction from that perspective?
I think there's still a way to go, if I'm honest. I mean, I suppose it depends on the culture in a particular jurisdiction. I mean, obviously, as far as Gibraltar is concerned, we think we have a robust regulatory regime. It is very much compliance focused. So again, people are bored with me saying this to them, but I think the view is in Gibraltar that we try to fix things at the lowest level of intervention. So we wouldn't move, for example, straight to an enforcement approach, although those powers certainly are given to us under the anti-money laundering legislation. So, and then when you look at, and I think I've also would say that I respect sometimes the culture in other jurisdictions. I know, for example, there's controversy in Sweden at the moment. There are regulators, or should we say politicians, introducing advertising restrictions, for example. Now, I don't think I would seek to criticise if a particular country wants to make a particular decision about how it treats gambling, as long as it does that in a non-discriminatory way and it applies across the board, then it's every right to do that. But there are mechanisms for regulators to start looking at areas of common interest. There's a European forum for regulators, there's an international forum for regulators, and I attend those along with colleagues from other regulators. When I hear someone sort of expounding a more prohibition stance, I would always try to temper that.
Well, I think that is a particularly area of interest, I think, to everybody. It would seem, I can easily say this, but it would seem that a lot of the decisions being made, especially around the likes of COVID-19, are fairly arbitrary without any sort of backup. I guess they've got to make decisions quickly. But still, as you mentioned, Sweden, whether it was the Spanish bandit, the Dutch, etc., there's a lot of raft of socially responsibility changes have come in, not quite overnight, but in a very short period of time. Well, I'll come to you just generally on that collaboration discussion around that, because we have been talking around that for a while. What's your view? What have you seen generally around MOUs, regulators talking to each other? Do you see real progress?
Yeah, I'd say so. I know Malta is rapidly signing MOUs. I think the Isle of Man has a couple. Gibraltar, obviously, that it's they are always looking to kind of widen that net. I think over recent years we've had some good initiatives like IARGA, the International Association of Gaming Regulators. That in particular was bringing together testing and other jurisdictions accepting each other's test certificates as common standards. So I know that's something that Gibraltar obviously looks at as well. But it helped the industry from that perspective. But I think, could regulators do more? I'm not sure they could, to be honest. But they continue to obviously keep discussing with each other and how best to fine tune the approach. But everyone's got a kind of different standpoint. I know the Isle of Man is going down kind of further regulation and following more of a UK route, same as Malta. But it'd be interesting to see what happens.
I think, Neil, I think from your perspective, I guess, is there a couple of key areas? If there were going to be this collaboration, is there a couple of key areas you'd identify straight away that they could be working on?
Yeah, so I think we can all acknowledge, anybody that works in any industry that's regulated or needs to be regulated, that there's two really, really important parts to any business when it comes to regulation. One is making sure that it's not a source of crime or supporting bad things around the world that we don't want to see happen anymore. And the other part to that is making sure that it's also not damaging communities and people, like having a bad impact, so social responsibility. So, in gambling, it's really obvious for us because, it's so pronounced what we have to deal with. But I mean, the same applies to like Amazon when it's shipping out packages. Are they using sustainable sources? But I think the main thing I would say that could work, that maybe perhaps isn't quite there yet, is that we look at a lot of regulation just on the facts of regulation. The Financial Action Task Force comes out and says, we think this is the best way now to manage anti-money laundering. People read, Section 3, Paragraph 4 says, exactly €5,000, do this or do that. And then everybody goes and implements it just based on that. Whereas, traditionally in compliance, what should always be looked at, and especially for governance risk and compliance from the top down, is the philosophical part of that and the ethical part as well. So regulators at the minute have the mandate to set the regulation. That has to be very fact-based, can't be too subjective. But in the same sense, I think there could be some room in there. We talk about MOUs, that's great, but actually make it a proper memorandum of understanding, which is a philosophical goal. So we know anti-money laundering is inextricably linked with responsible gambling as well. So if we take a slightly more philosophical approach, you have the UK that's quite burdensome in regulation. It's all the letter of the law. Well, we get a lawyer and we pick through that and we follow exact rules. Whereas what you're describing there, Andrew, where you're talking about working with an operator, one of the advantages is similar in the Isle of Man. When you're a smaller jurisdiction, that one-to-one personal discussion to say, well, that's just common sense. The goal is achieved at preventing crime. So I think more of a broad philosophical look as well as just the factual look. I know it gets hard in large scale.
Yeah, I guess, I think if you look, I'll come to you in a second, Jerry. I think if you look at what the UK was criticised for probably a year or so ago was lack of engagement. And it's clearly a bigger regulator, but it certainly withdrew from that conversation, or seemed to, from that conversation with the industry. And I would suspect that any of the Malta, Gibraltar, Isle of Man, that's a big plus. I think, Jerry, what as an operator, what do you want to see in those areas? What could you think could be aligned across them, or would make a jurisdiction stand out?
Let me think. I think probably number one thing is the KYC and AML framework, because from an operator perspective, in order to, the best solution for us is actually to have more standardized KYC AML framework, so that when we actually try to expand into multiple jurisdictions, we don't need to customize too much in terms of our procedure and product requirement. Obviously, we understand every jurisdiction have a different requirement of the regulation, but overall, from operator perspective, we also want to lower the cost from the inside of operator. But
I guess just on that point, because I think it's obviously an area that I'm interested in, and let's not even start talking about Germany. But the fact, Andy, from a regulator's point of view around AML, KYC, do you see an area where is that going to change at all from your perspective, and do you see areas you can collaborate with across jurisdictions?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I suppose, again, it depends on to some extent, the culture of the regulator and also the political climate in which the regulator exists. I mean, I'll answer the question more fully in a minute. I mean, a fellow regulator recently asked me, how do you square off the idea that, first of all, you work for a jurisdiction that is business supportive of the gambling industry, yet you're also expected to be the regulator? To which I said, it's not difficult, because it's about close engagement. It's about building trust with the operator. It's about having candid conversations about their systems and controls, and ultimately agreeing, a plan with them. And then if they don't deliver on the promises, that they make, then obviously you can take a harder line. So I've never seen the difficulty in reconciling the two issues. I suppose the difficulty to obviously get a common regulatory approach is some people have moved very much to a sort of enforcement position as far as regulation is concerned. Yeah. Whereas I think we would always go through that in an ideal world, a compliance position first, and only move to an enforcement position if there was a very significant breach of either the Gambling Act, the POCA requirements, or the Gambling Commissioner's advice here, for example. But it is a bit like describing an elephant. It is difficult sometimes, because people say, well, exactly what thresholds do I have to start my EDD at? And I say, well, look, this is a risk-based position. Both you and I know what a high risk, high depositing, high spending, high losing customer looks like. Yeah. I don't really have to define that for you. And you might say that's a regulatory cop-out to a degree, but I think we all know who the high risk customers are. And then obviously there's issues around the fringes and how low a regulator expects thresholds to be set. But I mean, I've not found any difficulty. I think we should create as little friction as possible for what I would call standard retail leisure customers. And then obviously in terms of VIP customers, for example, the operator should already be building a relationship with those customers. And therefore those conversations which have to come at a later time about, source of funds or source of income, might be less difficult, but they've got to set those conversations up for them to take place.
The challenges of a risk-based approach. The industry started asking for prescriptive ones when it came to safer gambling, but no, I get what you're trying to say. I think, from my view, we have moved on in the last couple of years. I think there's a clearer picture, certainly around things like VIPs. So it's that working closely on defining what that is. Is that the sort of thing, Jerry, from your perspective, sort of if it was a startup business and your time looking at the markets for stars, is that the sort of flexibility Asian facing businesses are looking for?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'll say particularly any Asian facing business. I mean, I think it's very important for a successful operator to define the risk level of its players. As Andy just mentioned, from the experience I have seen, most of successful Asian-facing operators, they are actually very, very careful in terms of their risk assessment, in terms of recreational players as well as the VIP players. And I think it's it's actually operators' responsibility to define what is actually high risk, what is the low risk from an operator perspective. And very important, I think another one is very important is that we probably, I think as an operator, we also want frequent and more frank conversation with the regulators, try to make sure we are on the same page. And that kind of a guidance, I think, is needed from an operator side.
Yeah, and I guess that's only working in collaboration. There's a couple of questions I'll come to now before diving back into a couple of topics we've set up. So there's a question here, Andy, will Gibraltar wait to see the outcome of the UK review of their gambling app before finalising your own?
I don't think it's even clear at the moment when the official government review of I know that the all-party group is conducting its own review of the Gambling Act at the moment, but that is an all-party group and not a select committee. And therefore one would imagine that there will be some degree of review, but again, I'm not too sure that that's been completely finalised as yet. I mean, there's been a lot about the UK Gambling Act being not fit for purpose. The issue is very much, I think, the legislation may be fit for purpose. It's whether or not people necessarily agree or disagree with how that legislation is applied, which I think is mainly the debate in the UK. And of course, in the UK, gambling is permitted unless there's going to be risks around the 3 licensing objectives, for example. So I think it's more a debate around culture and application than anything else. In terms of waiting, no. Initially, there was a commitment to have quite a lot of this work done by the end of Q2 of this year. But for obvious reasons, that's likely to slip towards Q3 and to the back end of the year because of the COVID-19 crisis. But I mean, whilst I wouldn't describe we're in business as usual, business as not usual. I mean,
normal.
Yeah, I mean, the minister has made it very clear that actually the work around the legislation, the codes, the money val remediation work that we're currently engaged in is all being done now. While, for example, my guys aren't out site visiting, for example. So, I mean, we've got a bit more time to do that sort of policy work, and I think it's we keep an eye on what's going on in the UK, but our legislation has got to be fit for purpose around the aspirations of the jurisdiction in terms of emerging market business, Asian business, startup business, etc. So to be honest, I don't see there's a reason to wait for the amendment and updating of the UK Gambling Act, which could probably take another 12 to 18 months.
And I'd agree with that. And I think the challenge they've got in the UK is just trying to change that in the political climate they've got. It needs a bit more of a reasoned view, which I'm not sure we're getting at the moment. But that's the problem for the UK, I guess. Quick question again, just aimed at you, Andrew, just because it's fairly specific. So what's the timeline for response on the consultations that have been going on? And also, when do you expect the new requirements sort of entering into force?
Well, again, the consultation is sort of active. Certainly, we've got a tech consultation out at the moment. And if anybody hasn't seen that, please contact me. We have circulated it quite widely through the Gibraltar Betting and Gaming Association and through individual operators. But please contact me if you haven't seen a copy of that. And to be honest, every step of the way, we're in the process and quite well progressed at the moment with drafting the new legislation, but plainly we would put that out for consultation, and if there were specific issues around codes, etc., we would also put that out to consultation. I'm a great believer that you don't need great long consultation periods, having worked in both the private side and the public sector side. If you give someone a 6-month consultation period, they only answer it after 5 months and 3 weeks away. And so, quite honestly, whether it's
an operator laughing over there, which is Paul going, probably, yeah.
So getting your homework done.
So to be honest, if we give people a month to turn the consultation response around, we will. But if anybody has any ideas now, because every business has a different model, about what changes they would like to see, I'm more than happy to have that debate either on Zoom or by email or wherever now, so that even with the technological changes, whether it's integrations, aggregators, etc., I'm learning on a case-by-case basis what works and what doesn't.
Okay, I think let's quickly, sort of got a quarter of an hour left, just dive into a couple of the more contentious, interesting areas of it. Neil, it's at the Isle of Man. You've seen the stuff Malta's doing around, say, crypto sports or something like that. So everybody starts shaking their head. But what do the regulators need to be and want to be in this area? You're a specialist on that side. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's still a great deal of misunderstanding about like cryptocurrency, especially as a payment method, and I guess also because of the way that the cryptocurrency markets, with the big Bitcoin pump in 2017 and everything, it's not really helped. People kind of view them as something like a get-rich-quick scheme. and they're kind of ignoring that the technology underlying. It's actually really, really helpful for a number of things that we struggle with many other forms of payment. I mean, a lot of gaming companies struggle to get bank accounts at the minute, for example. And like with cryptocurrency, it's fully auditable, fully traceable. You could give the regulator access to the account that holds your cryptocurrency to maintain balances, for player protections. They could just go and look whenever they want. If you send it, they're going to know where you sent it. So I think there seems to be some perhaps appropriate caution about using it, but I think sooner or later the regulators and governments are going to have to kind of start looking at some of these new products that are out there, especially when it comes to payments and cryptocurrency, and moving towards, like, you know, if they're not comfortable with them right now, maybe put out a consultation or ask for advice. A lot of businesses will give free advice to say, look, here's how it actually works here, you know, to make the industry work better, really.
Yeah. Paul, your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think, you know, I've seen in the Isle of Man, I think the Isle of Man regulator has a few gaming companies that are licensed that are heavily involved in crypto. I suppose from a Gibraltar perspective, I know we've touched this topic quite a bit with Andrew. And Andrew also goes, when operators inquire about crypto, Andrew's happy to go and look at this, but he wants a business case first. You know, he wants to understand the AML issues. He wants to understand the flow, and at that point, the operators tend to back off quite a bit. So it's an interesting one. I know definitely Gibraltar was quite an early to the market in terms of noise about, you know, look, we're open for business from a crypto perspective.
Well, I think we'll leave Andy to last on this one. Jerry, I'll come to you next, which is it's obviously the AML issues. What's your view on sort of digital currencies, crypto, their place in the regulated market?
Sure. I think from operator perspective, obviously, crypto is actually a great new method for the payment, as Neil just mentioned. But I think we are equally careful on the balance between the convenience and the regulation, because, for example, if we want to implement a crypto-based payment, we definitely want the enough KYC to be done, both on the payment PSP side as well as from the operator side. Because ultimately, when we present a payment method and also player protection fund, this regulation to the players, we want the players to feel very, very comfortable that any payment they are making, including the crypto, are actually well regulated. So I would say any regulator, if we can actually have a very good regulation framework on the crypto, especially on the payment KYC side, will definitely have an advantage in the overall space.
Yeah, I think, Andy, I guess natural to come to you, but I think that area of payments and crypto is clearly one that comes up across jurisdictional. What's Jib's position on that at the moment?
Well, obviously, Gibraltar's got a regulated regime through the financial services regulator here for distributed ledger technology, and it has licensed a number of companies who are applying DLT in a particular way. So there is an appetite within Gibraltar for DLT and crypto businesses, and the two aren't necessarily the same, although I know the technology is the same. And certainly from a gambling point of view, every time someone comes to me with a proposition, I mean, virtual currencies are now included in the Fifth Money Laundering Directive, and I simply say, look, if you can plug this into your existing systems by the use of regulatory technology, by chain analysis, and again, come back to me with a demonstrable system that you are confident will work, then there is no reason why you can't employ that sort of model. And it comes in waves. When I first arrived in Gibraltar 2.5 years ago, it was very busy with people applying, asking about crypto. It seems to have gone away a bit, where the firms are focused on American market entry or UK regulation or whatever they're focused on. It seems to have gone away. But I mean, all the big banks still have DLT and crypto projects, and distributed ledger technology probably can be applied to other parts of the business. It might assist with payments, etc. But I think certainly, I mean, I always say when someone comes to me and says, will you back this? I simply say, well, at the end of the day, I'm an agnostic on this. You convince me and get me over the line, but you need to get yourself over the line first.
So come back with a plan.
Idea, but Not a plan, huh?
Well, I was on the other side of the camera. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to mention the SBC conference, but I attended the SBC the SBC conference, and there was a discussion about crypto there, and I sort of said, why hasn't it caught on amongst the major operators? And the answer that came back was because obviously there are many legitimate payment methods that are available to those operators at any event. So they haven't started to think outside the box. So, but, you know, literally my door is open to anybody who comes with a viable proposition, and that can be supported by the wider Gibraltar regulatory regime. So if they need to add an exchange onto that or whatever, one part could be regulated by the GFSC and the other part might be regulated on the gambling side. Although, we try to avoid dual regulation where we can.
Yeah, Neil, last point on sort of crypto or virtual currencies to you, and I know you're our techie guy, so don't take up the next 10 minutes. But what's your view generally on where that's got a place in the sector?
So I think it's going to be payments and bank accounts. Bank accounts is just a nightmare, isn't it? Let's face it. Expensive, difficult to get, and actually difficult for the regulator to work with as well. So I think in that sense, audit histories is a big thing. So what we are really, really lacking when you use team tools like Jira, and you see the audit history and you go, oh, isn't that great? I can see that Jeff was in here, Chris was in here, and it was him that deleted that really important thing. Those things are great, and what I think cryptocurrency and blockchains will deliver for the industry is going to be that transparency, but not the fear of oversharing, because it has that pseudonymous feature to it. So a company could, for example, say to the regulator, here's our address, monitor this. So instead of asking us for a daily player balance on protection of funds, you just have it. You get a notification when it changes, but the rest of the world doesn't know what that is. They have no idea who that is. So I think they're the kind of key areas.
So it's the challenge, because clearly you're pro it. What's the challenge for regulators? Is it just understanding it, or is it adoption by consumers, or what's holding it back?
I think there's two parts to it. The KYC part is quite, doesn't have to be challenging, but it kind of is. So there's two things. This is the libertarian Bitcoin down with the dollar and like free world economy sort of thing. You've got to separate that from the actual like financial, this is how we do business. We do business in a certain way. We do our due diligence. And the two have been intermingled. The challenge is really KYC, set a standard and work with it. It won't be perfect to start with. You could have a Bitcoin that was part of a tainted batch. Whose responsibility is that? Who loses their money? Like when a car gets stolen or you buy a stolen car. I think that's really the main piece to it. The rest of the technology, other than maybe getting a wallet hacked, that shouldn't be possible in today's world. If you're using the right security techniques, you should have absolutely secure wallets. It should just be a KYC issue, really.
All right, that's clearly an area of expertise. I think that's Neil. So I think my view is always it's difficult for regulators to work around new technologies. They're almost naturally going to be sort of a step behind. So the challenge is to keep up with that. I think we're sort of running out of time. So I'll come to a question, because obviously they're all sort of related to yourself. So one question is around, so in an increasingly regulated worldwide gambling market, which of the emerging markets for gambling-related services appear to be holding the biggest potential for gambling companies in Gibraltar?
Well, I'm plainly, as far as business expansion is concerned, I mean, a lot of our operators are interested in Latin America, and then obviously there's interest in Asian countries, and then obviously some interest as well, and there has been for some time in Africa as well. And I know there's been some controversial stories about sort of gambling in Africa, but at the end of the day, one of the things that we'd be quite keen to do because of our geographical location is perhaps to partner with some of those African regulators in the different countries to see whether or not we could lend our expertise in that area. And certainly operations might be able to run partially or wholly out of here, but with broad jurisdictional acceptance as well. So, I mean, I think, operators are looking at a lot of different markets at the moment, because I think, even some of those European markets, which they expected to add significant growth to their bottom line, isn't happening because of the nature of the way that regulation is developing. So I think people are looking into new and emerging markets. But if you're involved in that regulation to a greater or lesser degree, you still have to think about the reputation of the jurisdiction.
Yeah, just quickly with the other guys. Paul, I'll start with you. I guess that sort of the LATAM, Asia, Africa combinations pretty standard. Is that your view as well?
Yeah, it is. It's kind of, I think the problem you've had really, companies are, if you look at UK, you look at the changes coming in Germany, I see one of the questions here around, do we think online stakes are inevitable? I think definitely they would be, and they are. It's kind of difficult for the UK to justify why you'd have it on land-based and not online. But it's those elements of those parts of the regulations that's really squeezing the bottom line. So it becomes, unless you have a significant market share in some of these regulated territories, it becomes unviable to continue operating in them. So this is kind of course, puts us to a point where, every operator, B2B game vendors, aggregators, they're all looking at new emerging markets where they can maybe go and establish a presence. And I think, Gibraltar changing a little bit of its approach in the markets that it will allow operators to go into, I think is only a good thing and will help with that. And it allows it to go in a stable, well-regulated way.
Yeah. This isn't just about B2C. I mean, this is just about B2C. This is B2B. This is B2B business people selling their tech platforms, selling their intellectual property, selling their game content, etc. So to be honest, I mean, there's an opportunity as much for the B2B sector here as there's the B2C sector.
Yeah, good point. Look, I think we're about to run out of time. So I guess if we could sum up, well firstly, two areas, Andy, which is around new regulations going to be in place when, and then just summarize those key points of the changes around sort of flexibility around substance, mind and management. So two things, when's new regulation expected and what's the key points it's going to deal with?
Well, before COVID-19, aspirationally, it was going to, most of the hard lifting and most of the drafting would have been done by the end of Q2. I suspect it will now slip into Q3. It's then a question of, once all that drafting is done, finding the necessary parliamentary time to move that through the system, which obviously will be a matter for the sponsoring minister as well. But I mean, I've got a 5-year contract in Gibraltar. I've done 2.5 years, and I would very much like my legacy to be that, I was part of changing the legislation and changing the framework. I'm not here just to let the time run out. So if it's anything to do with me, this side of Christmas, but who knows what will happen, whether we're released from lockdown and we end up going into a second one. So
I've nailed you to this side of Christmas. You're not taking that back. So no. And finally, I guess just those key points around what changes are going to look like, because I mentioned a couple of them there, just a couple of key bullet points for the audience.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the more flexibility around the technology. But one of the things that I'm very conscious of is that the Gibraltar technology industry grew up on the gaming industry. And therefore, if it's possible for that industry to remain having a stake in the overall architecture, that's something that, we would like to achieve. But that's a conversation we're about to start with our operators now. Because we have got some good tech providers and they have got hubs in other locations as well. So dismissing them and just moving straight to hypercloud, I think, is oversimplistic in my view. So there is a debate to be had there. In terms of the legislation, the one thing about the current Gibraltar Gambling Act is it's just not very flexible. It says you're licensed or you're not. And although we don't intend to move to an enforcement-based approach, it needs a more flexible regulatory regime to act across the whole spectrum of compliance and enforcement. And then obviously it's going to give more power to the minister to make regulations, which means actually we can move more flexibly in terms of changing tech, changing times, changing standards of AML, etc. And I've heard about the issue about regulatory certainty, and we would consult on changes like that. But it's modernize and make it more flexible.
All right, last point, each of you guys start with Paul. You feel that's an approach that's going to work? I know we've got Andy on the panel, but and it looks like he's got his family on here, because looking at the latest, everybody's confident we're heading in the right direction. Paul, thoughts for you?
From my perspective, definitely, I think it's great. I think Andrew's unlocked a lot of the maybe issues that Gibraltar's had in the past, and the reason why companies may not have come here. So I think it's great that they're opening kind of up to wider business, like we said earlier, not just blue chip. And just, we'll see where it goes, really. I think there's a lot of interest at the minute, and it's all very positive.
Neil, do you think it's increasingly it is flexibility now?
Yeah, where I mentioned like a philosophical approach earlier, that's really difficult to manage. But what you're suggesting there, Andy, I think is just a common sense approach where you do get to have that conversation. I think that's going to be very appealing to a lot of companies. We need that kind of approach now. Can't just be standard Section 4, Paragraph 3 everywhere, you know?
Yeah. And Jerry, last word with you, I guess. If you were looking for a new regulatory regime, it's that flexibility on a number of issues.
Definitely, yes. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, look, thanks to everybody. Thanks to everybody on who answered the polls, who sent in the questions. Thanks to the panelists. Really enjoyed it. We're going to take a break for a couple of weeks now. But certainly, I think if we look at how regulations change, it's been great. So I thank everybody for the time. Wish everybody be safe and well, and hope they start lifting the lockdown restrictions soon. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Bye-bye.